Hi, my name's Phil. I like to talk about politics. In this video, I'd like to discuss the latest week in Trumpland, where he failed to handle an unexpected question at a press conference and then announced his refusal to support a bill for funding the postal service and COVID because, well, he doesn't want people voting this November. Actually, that's unfair. He just doesn't want people voting for Biden this November. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So, President Trump had a bit of a weird moment in a press conference this week. So, yeah, yesterday morning I was woken to the news that he'd been asked, rather unexpectedly, as you can imagine, if he regretted all the lies he told the American public over the last few years. Needless to say, the orange one didn't answer it, and he did move on to the next correspondence question, but it wasn't exactly smooth. You know, there was no wry smile and a good one and then moving on, as someone a bit more sophisticated may have done. No, he seemed a little bit confused. What? Lies, you know, misinformation. Oh, who? You, Mr. President. I'm asking the question of you. What? Huh? Hmm? It was like a puppy that wasn't quite sure what you're trying to say to them. But that was merely the feel-good highlight in a pretty terrible week for morality in Trump's America. On much more serious news, though, the Postal Service, I gather, is in need of some funds. Making a loss, you know. Especially as it's going to need to be involved to handle the so-called universal mail-in system for the presidential election. Now, Trump is blocking this, along with the COVID support money. Now, as I understand it, you know, this is the way things can work in America. It's really weird. You don't really get that in the UK to an extent. So, Democrats, of course, want this bill to provide funding for the Postal Service to allow for the capacity to deal with the mail-in votes that are going to be needed to allow everyone to vote in the presidential election safely. But the Republicans are not too keen on this idea because it's not in their interest to do so. So it's been tied to a bill for funds for COVID support as well. And it's not, in terms of general spending by US governments, a huge amount of money. But it is an amount of money that Trump and arguably the Republicans in general do not want spent. And you know, tying what are completely unrelated things together in the same bill, I gather from my casual observation of American politics, seems to be quite common. You know, to sneak one thing through tied to another more popular thing, so that, you know, people don't oppose it. However, of course, America is very, very partisan these days, and compromise is not really the thing. And why are the Republicans opposing this? And it's really because those, if you think about the sort of person most likely to vote by mail, it would essentially be those who are either taking sensible precautions to avoid as much stranger contact as possible, or those living in states where such measures are basically required. In other words, most postal voters, not all, but most postal voters are likely to be those who are not intellectually backwards. Unfortunately, for President Orange One, people who are not intellectually backwards tend not to vote for Trump. They're very, very unlikely to. Than those who would actually choose, if they had the choice, those who would actually choose to cram themselves in line for hours with dozens of strangers all around them, coughing and spluttering, probably with a pistol tucked into their belt for good measure. The president's exact words were, "If we don't make a deal, that means they can't have the money. That means they can't have universal mail-in voting." I mean, he's not even being subtle about it, is he? I mean, surely you'd come up with some bullshit to explain your opposition to the postal funding. You would, you know, there's all sorts of arguments you could come up with. And anyone with a brain would know what it's really about. But it's not those people that you're trying to convince. The fact that he is openly saying that his objection to the funding was because he didn't want all Americans to be able to use mail-in voting. In other words, he didn't want Americans to have this capacity for voting. by mail means he doesn't care what people think of his reasons. It's not like he's someone who tries to avoid lying. Doesn't mind lying at all. Here, he just doesn't see the need for it. And you know, that this isn't sparking universal outrage is simply because America has become so partisan, so deeply tribal, that Trump feels that there is nothing to gain by trying to pretend he has any noble motives and nothing to lose by being open about his villainy. And, you know, he's essentially saying, I want to increase the proportion of my support base who will be able to vote and reduce the proportion of anyone else. It's really that simple. And the only conclusion, you know, to any form of basic decency was that he said if a deal were reached, he said if a deal were reached that included the postal funding, he wouldn't veto it. But presumably that's because he expects Republicans in Congress to block it themselves and to stay blocking it. And this is where I start to sort of think aloud on this issue, because I'm thinking, you know, and perhaps some actual Americans or American observers can let me know what they think. So what do the Democrats and the Republicans do here? Because you've got this bill that's going to provide COVID support. Now, neither side really wants to say that they're blocking that. So both of them would like to say that the other side is actually blocking it. The Democrats will say that the Republicans are blocking it because, well, objectively they are. The Republicans will say that the Democrats are blocking it because they say, well, if they just remove this totally unrelated thing about the postal funding, then we will support it, which is also fair enough. So, and you do have a situation, I gather, in polls in America where there are people on both sides blaming either party. Again, very tribal. And this doesn't seem to have crossed those tribal lines. You know, so what do you do? So if you're the Democrats, for example, do you stand firm and continue to blame the Republicans for blocking COVID support? Put the emphasis on COVID. This is a bill that's going to provide COVID support as well as funds for the election. And then the Republicans, of course, will just claim the Democrats are blocking the COVID support by not backing down on this totally unrelated aspect of the bill. Would it stick? Would Democrats care if, you know, from a purely heartless, you know, calculating point of view, if the lack of that support means a much worse time? You know, presumably that money for COVID support is going to be put to some good use, which means if it's not, then the good that was intended is not going to happen. So America will suffer more from COVID over the next few months. And of course, it will be the government mostly in the firing line there. Do you really want to re-elect a president who has presided over this nightmare situation for our country? You know, and then, you know, what do the Republicans do? Do the Republicans tough it out, thinking to themselves, well, yes, we may lose some people if we are seen as the bad guys, but at the same time, we really do believe that if universal mail-in voting was properly funded, then that would mean that our guy in the White House will definitely lose because he's been absolutely killed in the polls. Obviously, the polls are probably a bit trickier to read in America, as they can sometimes be in the UK, just because if you actively have mechanisms in place to block certain groups from voting, like people who don't want to die, for example, and then, you know, they may take the calculation, well, we can take a hit in terms of public opinion, but it will enable us to have more chance of winning the presidential election. You know, so what's the calculation, I wonder? But there it is anyway. It's pretty shocking stuff. And, you know, I always have to look around me, immediately around me in the UK, and thinking, we're sort of following, aren't we? We're following on. And it will only be a matter of time before Boris Johnson cottons onto this. I mean, he already has a plan to try and disenfranchise people from voting in the next general election. But with any luck, he'll be removed long before then, before he can put it into place. And maybe his successor will or will not go ahead with that. We'll have to see who that would be. But those are my thoughts on the American situation anyway. Let me know yours in the comments below. I hope you found the video interesting. If you did, don't forget to click the like button. And if you'd like to support the channel further, please also click the Patreon link for details. And until next time, I'll see you later.